So, when the FAFSA update happened last year, the way the FAFSA is accessed shifted. So it's a roles-based process now. So each person who is needed to contribute information on the FAFSA enters it separately using their own FSA ID. So whoever is beginning the FAFSA then needs to invite the other contributors using their name, social security number, date of birth, and any email address. The email address does not have to be the same one that that person used to set up their FSA ID, but the rest of it does need to be the same. So legal name, correct social security number, and correct date of birth. This sometimes can be a challenge when students are inviting parents, and sometimes when parents are inviting students. So this is a place where communication is definitely going to be necessary to get it correctly. Often one of our problems we see is parents are not getting the invite to do their portion of the FAFSA, and that is usually because there's some error in the name, social, or date of birth. In the FAFSA, a contributor is the new name for anyone who needs to provide information on the FAFSA, but it does not mean contributing money. Okay. It is not who is required to pay, just whose information is needed on the form. So it's contributor of information to determine federal, possibly institution, and possibly state aid. And each of the contributors have to consent now, and they must give consent and approval for their federal income tax return information to be accessed by the IRS and provided to FAFSA in order to do the calculations. If a parent, student, or spouse will not consent, the student is not eligible for federal financial aid. And some of you may remember the rather painful process of trying to remember the exact address of your tax return 2 years ago and not quite getting it to match up. You no longer have to do that. Now it's just a consent button. You approve. Okay. So who is a contributor? We started with first you have to ask, are you dependent or independent? Once you've clarified that, then who else has to contribute? So for dependent students, the question is which parent or contributor information is required. So if their biological or adoptive parents live together, both parents' information is used regardless of whether they're married or not. If they don't live together, then the parent who provided more support to the student in the past year is required to complete the FAFSA as a contributor. If they are 50-50, which we often get families saying, well, we have it split equally, then the questions you might want to ask are who carries the student on their health insurance? Who supplies the student with a car or car insurance? It's basically who is providing more support to that student. And if the parent who is providing more support to that student is married, even if it's a recent marriage, then the parent and the step parent both provide information as contributors. And if neither parent provided more support and it's truly 50-50 and you can document like every penny is split, well, I guess every two pennies are split, then it's the parent who has more income and assets who are supposed to report on the FAFSA as a contributor. If you're independent, then it's a little shorter list. If you're married, it's the student and their spouse, even if the marriage is recent. And if they are single, separated, or divorced and not remarried, it is just that independent student who provides information.
So let's talk about determining financial need. You may have heard of something called an EFC. Well, the EFC is no longer with us. What is in its place is an SAI, or a student aid index. It's determined slightly differently than that EFC. But we want to be clear, the student aid index is a starting point for a college, for a state grant program, for scholarship programs to determine financial aid eligibility. It does not indicate what the student or family has to pay. Part of that expected family contribution, the reason why it's been retired, is because people heard EFC and thought that is what I'm required to pay. Well, what we found is that that is not often what families are required to pay. Sometimes it's the family ends up having to pay more than their EFC. So right now, the way that that's determined is income, and they compare that to federal poverty guidelines. And if a student meets those income criteria, they might be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant or a minimum Pell Grant, which is really great. But they also have a calculation if they're not eligible for either thing or they're eligible only for the minimum. They want to go through and see if the student's eligible for more than the minimum Pell Grant. And so they're going to look at things like assets that the parent has, the age of the older parent, or if an independent student, the age of the student. There's actually a federal student aid estimator website, and that's really great. We have the link there. Families can use it. They can figure out what sorts of federal aid they might be eligible for. The income that's coming over on the FAFSA is coming from a prior year income. That is federal student aid's fancy way of calling it the taxes that were filed before the student school year that they're applying for. So if a student's attending college now, they are submitting the FAFSA now until June 30th of 2025. They're using tax information from 2022. If a student is looking to go next September, they're going to be applying between December 1st and June 30th of 2026. They're using tax return income from 2023. And like Stacy mentioned, this is automatic. It happens seamlessly. I'm going to tell you a reason why you need this information in just a minute. And then if a junior, parent of a junior, is asking about this, they would be using tax info from this year, from 2024. That way people don't have to estimate and then verify taxes later on. They can use a tax return that's already been filed. And I mention this because